From dominating a region to conquering the 6 states, he has been renowned throughout the ages for accomplishing the great cause of unification. From consolidating the unification to strengthening autocracy, he has been cursed and defamed for implementing tyranny. With mixed evaluations and half praise and half blame, Emperor Qin Shi Huang is also an emperor with the most mysteries which have remained unsolved for thousands of years. Who on earth was his biological father? Why didn't he appoint an empress and a crown prince? Let's travel through time and space together to unearth the historical truth. One day in BC, in the palace of the Qin dynasty's capital, Xianyang, a grand ceremony was about to be held. On that day, Yang Assassinate, the king of Qin, was particularly delighted. He wore formal attire like mine, haha. Then he used the most solemn etiquette. During the pre-Qin period, the most solemn etiquette among our vassal states was called the Tiang 9 guest ceremony. What was the 9 guest ceremony, Daore? It meant that 9 envoys would guide 1 guest to enter the hall, and that was the Tilai 9 guest ceremony. So on that day, the entire Xianyang palace of the Qin dynasty was filled with joy, and the whole court was permeated with a festive atmosphere. However, this scene where King Yang, Sassange of Qin, welcomed with the grandest etiquette eventually turned into a tragic farce. In the first lunar month of Sog, VC, a baby boy was born in Handan's Zhou state. Nobody would have thought that he would be Emperor Qin and Shaikan, the founder of the first unified empire in Chinese history. He inherited the throne of the Qin state at the age of took personal charge of state affairs at Asia, and completed the great cause of unifying China at that time, creating a unified dynasty. He called himself the first emperor, hoping that his descendants could inherit the throne from the 2nd generation to the 3rd generation, and so on indefinitely. However, he never expected that the great empire he had founded with his own hands would collapse with a crash after only 2 years. Those noble descendants of his died miserably, one by one, in Xianyang. A magnificent beginning ended up with a cruel outcome. The huge contrast in history makes Emperor Qin Shi Huang and his empire deservedly become eternal mysteries that have drawn the attention of later generations. How was this huge empire founded? What other unknown secrets were there about Emperor Qin Shi Huang? Let's travel through the mists of history and complete a historical exploration. Let's first focus our lens on the most dangerous experience in Emperor Qin Shi Huang's life. What did Emperor Qin Shi Huang experience this time? As it turned out, what was supposed to be held on this day was actually a ceremony for his state's surrender. After Yiling Disheng, the king of Qin, ascended the throne, he had already wiped out the states of Han and Zahao among the 7 warring states, and his army had already approached the border of the Yuan state. And the envoys sent at this time were precisely 2 envoys from the Yan state. These 2 envoys brought 2 gifts that made King Ying Jiaseng of Qin very happy. One was a human head and the other was a map. These were not ordinary gifts. The human head was that of a renegade general whom King Ying Jiaseng of Qin hated the most. This renegade general was named Fan Wuji, and now the head of the renegade general he hated the most was sent by the Yan state, so the king of Qin was especially happy. That was one happy thing. Another happy thing was that a map was sent. This map was not an ordinary map. It was a map of Dukang, the richest region in the Yan state among the 7 warring states at that time. In the era of cold weapon warfare, this map was very important. Moreover, it was a map of the richest region of the Yan state. After these 2 envoys arrived, they reported a message to King Ying Jiaseng of Qin through the attendants around the king, saying that the king of Yan was too frightened to come, and that the whole Yan state was going to become an internal vassal, which meant that the whole Yan state was going to surrender. So they sent the head of the renegade general Fan Wuji and the map of Dukang. The sending of this map actually represented that the Yaran state was going to surrender. So in the palace of the Qiudan dynasty, there was such solemn etiquette, and King Ying's session of Qiudan wore such beautiful formal attire because it was originally going to hold a surrender ceremony. Since King Ying's siege of Qiudan had already wiped out 2 other states among the 7 warring states by this time, and the 3rd state was coming to hold a surrender ceremony, could the king of Qiudan not be happy? After everything was ready, the 2 envoys from the Yan state made their appearance. The first of these 2 envoys was Jing Qi, who was quite famous in Chinese history, and the other was his assistant Tuan Weiyan. Jing Qi was carrying a box, and inside this box was the head of Fan Wuji. Well, after traveling for several months, it was estimated that this head might have already rotted. The other one, Tuan Weiyan, his deputy envoy, was holding a map of Dukan. In ancient times, that map was a long scroll rolled up. The 2 of them entered the hall and were guided by the 9 guest ceremony, and then the chief and deputy envoys walked into the Qiudan court. After arriving at the Qiudan court, Tuan Weiyan, the deputy envoy, was a warrior from the Yan state. He had killed someone when he was only years old. Just think about it, a person so young daring to kill someone could indeed be called a warrior. Tuan Weiyan was carrying the map, and Jing Qi was holding the box. But after entering the Qiudan hall and seeing that the hall was heavily guarded with numerous warriors, Tuan Weiyan fell apart when he reached the foot of the step. What do I mean by fell apart? His face turned ashen, and his legs trembled so much that he could hardly walk. This immediately caught the surprise of the ministers of the Qiudan state, because the ministers thought that the people from the Yan state who came to hold the surrender ceremony and present the map should not behave like this. So all eyes were focused on the deputy envoy Tuan Weiyan. Jing Qi also noticed this, and he looked back at the king of Qiudan and then smiled and gave an explanation to King Ying, Sanning of Qiudan. Jing Qi said that Tuan Weiyan was a rough fellow who grew up in a small place, had never seen a grand occasion before, and had never seen the Son of Heaven. So when he saw the Son of Heaven, he was so frightened, and he hoped that the king could forgive him and allow him to ascend the hall to complete his mission. After Jing Qi gave this explanation, King Yang Zahinj of Qiudan looked at Jing Qi, who was calm and composed, and then looked at Tuan Weiyan, whose face was ashen and whose whole body was trembling. So the king of Qiudan said a sentence asking Jing to present the map in the hall. This sentence meant that Tuan Weiyan was not allowed to ascend the hall. Then Jing Qi put down the box, took the map from Tuan Weiyan's hand, and ascended the main hall. Since the map was in the form of a scroll, when Jing Qi opened the map, he unfolded it bit by bit because it was rolled up. Jing Qi slowly unfolded the map, and the king of Qiudan was watching intently. When the map was completely unfolded, suddenly a dagger appeared from the innermost part of the map. This is a very famous phrase in Chinese history called "dagus." When the map was fully unrolled, the dagger was revealed. This dagger was no ordinary dagger. It was the most famous one at that time, called the Tea Lady Exu dagger, Tiu, which was a famous brand, and Tiao international brand, TL so to speak. Moreover, during the process of forging and processing this dagger, it had been repeatedly soaked in poisonous water. So this dagger had a function. Once it scratched a person's skin and touched blood in 4 words, it was Pi seal the throat upon seeing blood, Tio, and the person would die immediately. So this dagger was a highly poisonous one. When King Ying Jisinj of Qiudan saw that there was a dagger in the unfolded map, He was suddenly startled. But by this time, it was already too late. Zheng Qi's left hand grabbed the sleeve of the King of Qin, and his right hand grasped the dagger and stabbed directly at the King of Qin's chest. Of course, at this time, the only thought in King Yin Zhaosanj of Qin's mind was to survive. How to survive? He tugged and tore desperately. As a result, he pulled too hard and his left sleeve was torn off. Once the sleeve was torn off, Yin Zhaosanj got a chance to escape. It was said that Yin Zhaosanj took to his heels and fled, and Zheng Qian chased after him immediately. The two of them, King Yin Zhaosanj of Qin, was running around in the hall. He had no choice but to run around the pillar, and Zheng Qi was chasing after him. One chasing and one running, it was like a 5-meter race for a moment. At this time, Yin Zhaosanj wanted to fight back. However, the rules in the Qin dynasty's palace were very strict. All the ministers were not allowed to bring weapons when ascending the hall. The ministers had no weapons, and although the warriors below the stage had weapons, they couldn't ascend the hall without an order. Yin Zhaosanj was indeed wearing a sword, but his sword was too long. How long was it? It was 7 feet long, which converted, according to the current measurement, was meters long, 11 meters. So while King Yin Zhaosanj of Qin was fleeing, he was urgently trying to draw the sword from his waist. But the distance of his arm was not enough to fully extend 12 meters, and he just couldn't draw the sword out. It went without saying that the ministers had no way to block Zheng Qian with their hand. Zheng Qian was holding a highly poisonous sword. Whoever got close and was scratched slightly by it would immediately have their throat sealed upon seeing blood. At this critical moment, there was a man named Xe Obuki who was the imperial physician of Yin Zhaosanj, the king of Qin. Since he was an imperial physician, the personal doctor of the king of Qin, he was carrying a medicine bag with traditional Chinese medicine in it at that time. So in the emergency, Xe Obuki took off his medicine bag and threw it at Zheng Qian. When Zheng Qian was chasing after the king, he didn't know who threw the thing at him. But he vaguely felt something coming towards him. So he dodged and slowed down his pace for just a fraction of a second. Thanks to this Yin Zhaosanj, the king of Qin managed to run a few more steps. At this time, the ministers beside them also saw the trick. What was the trick? In order for Yin Zhaosanj, the king of Qin, to draw his sword, he had to move the sword to the back instead of wearing it at his waist. Where should it be moved to? To the back. So the ministers shouted in unison, "Dear Majesty, carry the sword on your back. Dear Majesty, carry the sword on your back." The character de here means de carry on the back de. Once you move the sword to the back and then draw it out from there, the distance would be enough to pull out the long sword, which was 10 meters long. So when the king of Qin heard the ministers shouting in unison, just like the cheerleaders shouting "Dadzi, carry the sword on your back," "Dad, your Majesty, carry the sword on your back," Dad, the Tetsa runner Dad got his strength and drew out the sword. Once the king of Qin pulled out this long sword, which was 11 meters long compared with the dagger in the middle of the map, which was only 7 inches long, it was like a ratio of 10-1 in the era of cold weapon. So once the king of Qin drew out his sword, Zheng Qian was immediately at a disadvantage. So with the first strike, the king of Qin cut Zheng Qian's left leg and Zheng Qian immediately collapsed. After collapsing, Zheng Qian didn't give up his assassination attempt. He threw his dagger like a flying knife at the king of Qin for the last time. However, Jin Ke's skill in throwing flying knives wasn't very good. The king of Qin dodged it, and the dagger just stabbed into a pillar. So Jin Kane had no weapons left in his hand. So the king of Qin rushed forward and slashed Jin Kane 8 times in a row, and Jin Kane was seriously injured and collapsed there. But at this time, according to historical records, Jin Kane had 8 words, which were Tia. Leaning against the pillar, he laughed and sat in a disrespectful posture while cursing Tia. That is to say, Jin Kane leaned against the pillar, looked up to the sky, and laughed loudly. He sat with his legs spread apart, which was a very disrespectful posture, and then started cursing. First he laughed, and then he cursed, saying, The only reason you escaped this disaster today is that I wanted to capture you alive. If I hadn't intended to capture you alive, you couldn't have escaped. At this time, the warriors below the platform rushed up and shot arrows at Jin Kane all at once and killed him. When Jin Kane's body was lying on the palace hall and Ying Zasheng, the king of Qin, was sitting on his throne facing Jin Kane's corpse according to historical records. Ying Zasheng, the king of Qin, was stunned for a long time and kept in a daze. Because just think about it, this was the first assassination he had encountered in his life. He had never experienced it before. It was equivalent to saying that this was the first time he had faced death, with one foot already stepping into the gate of hell and the other still in the mortal world. After being stunned for a while, he finally said, Tesha Wuki loves me. He said that this imperial physician Ixia Wuki liked him so much, and it was he who saved him. So in the end, he rewarded the imperial physician Asasaruki with 200 caddies of something, a very generous gift. This is the story of Jin Kane's assassination attempt on the king of Qin, which is very famous in Chinese history. This assassination in the Qin court was written by Sima Qin into the Tia biographies of the assassins, based in Bi records of the grand historian Tiaxia, and was recorded in the annals of Chinese history passing down through the ages. The story of Jin Kane's assassination attempt on the king of Qin took place in the late Warring States period. After a long period of wars among the feudal lords, with the states separated from each other, the pattern of prosperity and decline among the various vassal states had changed a lot, and the state that had changed the most was none other than the state of Qin. Through painstaking efforts in management, its economic and military strength was far superior to that of the other 6 states. The king of Qin was bent on unifying China and kept attacking the other state. In order to avoid the danger of being annexed, the state of Yan sent Jin Kane to assassinate the king of Qin. Thus, a tragic story of assassinating the king of Qin was staged in Chinese history. Jin Kane died, but his story had already deeply rooted in people's hearts and became widely known. He became the representative figure of assassins and was praised by people. While Ying Zasheng, the king of Qin, who survived, had only escaped the first disaster in his life, and then disasters came one after another. What other thrilling scenes happened to the king of Qin? It's true that the greatest and most significant thing in Ying Zasheng, the king of Qin's life, was unifying China. Subjectively speaking, he aimed to destroy the other 6 states, dominate as the hegemon, and bring the whole world under his rule. However, objectively, what he did conformed to the trend of historical development. This was indeed the greatest contribution made by Ying Zasheng, the king of Qin in history. But as a result of his actions for such an unprecedented and remarkable feat of destroying the 6 states, which represented the whole world at that time, the public enemy of the 6 states and the whole world, people who wanted to assassinate the king of Qin, were definitely not just Jin Kane alone. But most of them couldn't succeed. Why? because they didn't have the pass to enter the palace of the king of Qin and couldn't get in. Only Jin King could get in and almost succeeded. So we should first clearly understand that the attempt to assassinate Ying Zexing, the first emperor of Qin, was not just an act of Jin King alone. It was something that many people in the 6 states that were about to be destroyed at that time wanted to do. After Jin Ke was killed, Ying Zexing, the king of Qin, wanted to hunt down all of Jin King's friends. Jin Ke had a good friend named Gao Jianli, who was a master of music. Gao Jianli was implicated because of this incident and went into hiding under a false name and worked for others as a laborer. While working, Gao Jianli couldn't bear to be lonely. The master of the family where he worked especially liked playing the zhougu, an ancient musical instrument. As a laborer, Gao Jianli thought that the master didn't play it well when he heard it. So he often pointed out which parts were played well and which parts were not. But one should never speak ill of others behind their backs because it would surely be spread. Sure enough, these words reached the master's ears. When the master heard about it, he invited Gao Jianli over. Since the master said, "Sir, since you said this is good and that is not good about my playing, please come here." Once Gao Jianli played the zhouyu, everyone was astonished as he was such a master. Then Gao Jianli thought that there was no need to hide his identity anymore and started playing it publicly. His reputation grew bigger and bigger as he played, and finally, even Ying Zexing, the first emperor of Qin, heard about it. By then, Ying Zexing had already unified the whole country. Since Ying Zexing also wanted to listen to this kind of popular music at that time, he summoned Gao Jianli to the palace. However, after entering the palace, it was discovered that he was Gao Jianli, a close friend of Jin King. At this time, it should be said that Ying Zexing really cherished talented people, and this was an example. Since he both wanted to listen to his music and was afraid that Gao Jianli would become another Jin King, he came up with a method that seems rather cruel from our perspective today. He had Gao Jianli's eyes smoked until he went blind. He thought that if you were blind and couldn't see, you wouldn't be able to assassinate him. So he let Gao Jianli enter the palace. In this way, Gao Jianli gradually gained the trust of Ying Zexing, the king of Qin, and got closer and closer to him. Then Gao Jianli could roughly sense where Ying Zexing was based on the sound. Later, Gao Jianli filled the zhouyu with lead. Lead was very heavy. He took the zhouyu filled with lead and tried to hit the king of Qin with it at the shortest distance to complete the great feat of assassinating the king of Qin. But he didn't succeed. After all, a blind person was trying to hit someone who could see. Ying Zexing saw it and dodged it easily. As a result, Gao Jianli was killed. After that, Ying Zexing, the first emperor of Qin, learned a lesson that none of the people from the 6 states that he had destroyed could be allowed to get close, as any one of them might be an assassin. He no longer allowed them to approach him, and who else tried to assassinate him? It was King Liang. Everyone knows King Liang Kai. King Liang was a nobleman of the state of Han. After the state of Han was destroyed, King Liang sold his family property and hired an assassin. What's the modern term for it? It's something like hiring a hitman with a high salary. Since he couldn't get close this time, King Liang's way of assassinating was to use long-distance throwing. He got a big iron cone and threw it, but it just hit the carriage beside the one where the king of Qin was sitting. The king of Qin narrowly escaped death. Indeed, throughout Ying Zexing's life from before he unified the 6 states until after the unification, there were constantly people attempting to assassinate him. So Jin King's assassination attempt on the king of Qin was not an isolated incident. To some extent, Jin Qi unconsciously represented the anti-Qin forces of the Six States. It reflected the common psychology of the people from those states who were unwilling to be conquered by the state of Qin and wanted to assassinate the king of Qin. From Jin Kai's assassination attempt to Zhang Liang's hiring of an assassin to carry out the assassination, Yanning Zasanj, the first emperor of Qin, had multiple experiences of being assassinated in his life. Among them, only Jin Kai's assassination attempt was the most detailed one recorded in Tisei records of the grand historian Tisei, and also the one that came closest to success. Therefore, Jin Kai's assassination attempt had the greatest impact on later generations, and people's views on it varied. Some said that Jin Kai was a reactionary who went against the trend of history, while others said that Jin Kai was a chivalrous hero. What kind of act was Jin Kai's assassination attempt exactly? How should we evaluate Jin Kai? Since the impact of Jin Kai's event was so great, there were bound to be diverse opinions on the evaluation of Jin Kai. I'll introduce several main viewpoints. Firstly, ancient Chinese people wrote a large number of poems and proses eulogizing Jin Kai. Among these numerous poems and proses that praised Jin Kai, they all regarded Jin Kai as a hero. So the first evaluation of Jin Kai is that he was a chivalrous hero, an eternal, righteous man. This is how people viewed him. I'll give two of the most famous examples. The first one is Taizhou Yuanming, who is very famous in the history of Chinese literature. Taizhou Yuanming was a hermit. A hermit lived in seclusion in the countryside and didn't care about worldly affairs. But Taizhou Yuanming wrote a very famous poem called Dao Tu Jing Ket Das. In this poem, Taizhou Yuanming wrote two very famous lines, saying, "As though he has passed away, his spirit has lingered through the ages." It means that although this person has been dead for thousands of years, his chivalrous spirit still prevails today. Taizhou Yuanming was a great poet, so his stories ode to Jing Qianbao spread widely and had a great influence. There was also a less famous poet who wrote a poem with two lines, which were "'Tis a sad song, by the year river ceased, yet the heroic bones in the Qin court still smell fragrant." These lines still praise Jin Kai's chivalrous spirit. So regarding Jin Kai as a chivalrous hero was a very common and even mainstream view in ancient China. Of course, this evaluation mainly stayed at the moral level. Secondly, there was the view that Jin Kai was a foolish person. This view was just the opposite. It was not to praise Jin Kai but to criticize him. This view was put forward by two very famous people. The first one was Yang Tiyang, one of the four great masters of Hanfu in the Western Han Dynasty. Yang Zong first put forward this view. The second person who criticized Jin Kai was Sima Guang, the author of Bizizi, Tongka Jian Bi. Sima Guang criticized him, saying that Jin Kai was kept by Prince Dan, and then went to assassinate the king of Qin, ignoring the danger of his whole family being exterminated. It was really foolish. These were the two views of the ancients, one seeing Jin Kai as a chivalrous hero, and the other seeing him as a foolish person. As for modern people, they have more freedom in expressing their views, and there are roughly several views among them. One view is that Jin Kai was like a mercenary. We've read many stories of this kind. It's believed that Jin Kai ate, drank, and took things from others. In the end, since he had no way to repay Prince Dan, what could he use to repay? He could only repay with his life. So he was a mercenary, an assassin hired by Prince Dan. This is a very popular view among modern people. Another view is that Yanning Zasan's actions objectively conform to the trend of historical development. Liu Zheng was a hero representing the trend of historical development. Then since Jin Kai wanted to assassinate him, Jin Kai was going against the trend of history and was a reactionary. So after looking at the many views above, what's our final conclusion? It's that for Jing Ke, different people have different expression. Jing Ke was just one person, but everyone has their own views on him. And the story we just told is actually the first lecture in our series about the first emperor of Qin, which is called Da Di Jing Ke's assassination attempt on the king of Qin. The king of Qin later became the first emperor of Qin. And this first emperor of Qin is the most difficult emperor to talk about among more than 10 emperors in Chinese history. Moreover, this emperor left the most mysteries. First, who was his father? This is the first big question. He couldn't have popped out of a stone like Sun Wukong. It's unclear who his father was. Second, what did he look like? Historical records and people's analyses are different. Third, why didn't he appoint an empress? Fourth, why didn't he appoint a crown prince? Fifth, what was the mausoleum of the first emperor of Qin like? So the first emperor of Qin, the emperor through the ages, is a person that later generations can never finish talking about. He was the terminator of the Western just governance and the pioneer of the imperial system. Therefore, in order to clearly understand this emperor through the ages, we must understand the rise of the state of Qin and the era in which the state of Qin was located at that time. Then, how did the state of Qin rise? We'll talk about it next time.